everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And just to start us off with, this is going to be a bit of a potentially a bit of a triggering conversation, and beyond potentially, there's going to be triggering topics here. So please take care of yourself. And if at any point you feel overwhelmed or triggered, take care of you, exit. I don't take any of that personal. Self-care comes first. So, with that being said, hi, I'm Crystal Luis Garcia. I am an author. This is my book, From the Mud, The Alchemy of Self-Love Poetry, which is available on Amazon, also on my website. And so this is a poetry memoir book. It's my first book. I'm a self-love coach, transformational speaker, dream facilitator, and I'm a survivor of 13 years of sex trafficking, incorrectly called the sex industry, which includes BDSM. So, as far as my knowledge of BDSM, I was a professional dominatrix of 13 years, and I was a submissive and switch as well. And if you don't know what those words are, I am going to give a little bit of an explanation. So, if you don't know what BDSM is, that's awesome in this day and age, but I'm going to break it down for you. So, BDSM is an acronym. The B stands for bondage, the D stands for dominance and submission, the S stands for sadism, and the M stands for masochism. So, sadism is, if we're going to define sadism, it is getting off, like becoming aroused or deriving pleasure, but especially sexually aroused by causing pain, humiliation, and many different levels of suffering to someone. Now, masochism is deriving pleasure. And if you see me pause for a minute, I'm just letting people in, is deriving pleasure from receiving pain, humiliation, or different levels of suffering. And if you want to know more about the origins of these words, and I did do a video on a brief history of BDSM and how it started to leak into our society. That is on my YouTube channel. I'll put the links here, that you can access because I do have a video and I have a couple videos on BDSM already that will be available there, including a near 2-hour interview by my friend Tom, if you want to have a little bit of a history of where, my journey to this reality from being a dominatrix. So, and I created that last year at last year's End Sexual Exploitation Global Online Summit in a similar room. So you can also find more on my blog. The conversation that I am, the anti-BDSM conversation, my conversation is called Free from BDSM. And I have a blog and I created a website specifically for Me Too survivors and supporters of Me Too survivors. It's called freefrombdsm.com. And I will put that link again, as I said, in the chat. So I created this event to inform and educate people in the reality that there are Me Too survivors from BDSM and to create a conversation on how to treat the survivors of BDSM. So I'm also here to, prepare you in case you are presented with BDSM, the coercion, the manipulation, any of that. So you can be a little bit more prepared and ready on how to deal with that if someone's trying to push you into BDSM. And right now, I am the only one globally having this conversation that has the experience I do of 13 years in being in BDSM and now creating awareness that BDSM is abuse. And BDSM is a narcissistic and sociopathic haven. It does not mean that everybody in BDSM is narcissistic or sociopathic. And the problem with BDSM is it makes it hard to tell who's who. And that's problematic. That in itself is problematic. So, so here's some of the terms that I've used. You've heard the term dom, right? That is short for dominator, the person who's enacting the domination, and it's spelled D-O-M. So you'll see variations of this, such as D-O-M-M-E. However, that's inaccurate. It's not something that's used by those of us who are deeply in it and those of us who were were deeply in the world. We just never use that because a female dom would never create a distinction between her and a male dom. That would be considered beneath her. So if you see the spelling of D-O-M-M-E, it's not accurate, and it's usually by people who just have a surface level understanding of BDSM or kind of tried to create their own language of it. And the reason that's important and why I make that distinction is because I know BDSM on a level that a lot of people do not. And I've had interactions that a lot of people have not. So, so there's so the dom is usually the person who is obviously the one who is creating the session, quote unquote. It's actually abuse, but is normally the sadist, as I defined as earlier. So uh, there normally the dom is the one in control, but there are nuances in this, including when it comes to being a professional dominatrix. A lot of people don't understand that, and so they have a little bit of a misconception. But dom for pay is just a whole nother world. I did it both professionally and personally. So dom for pay, you're pretty much doing what you're told, really. So there's also pimps. There's a dungeon, which is really a house or any location where the pimp is they're taking money and they're there supposedly for your safety, but we all know that that's a lie because there's nothing safe about abuse. So the next term is submissive. The submissive is usually the person who is a masochist, and the submissive is someone who submits to the dom. Now, not everybody who is a submissive is a masochist. There are people who are nurturers who find themselves in a submissive position because they get preyed upon by the BDSM community. So it's not, so that can also be a misunderstanding that everybody who's a submissive is a masochist, and that's not always the case. There's a lot of nurturers who want to nurture who find themselves in trapped in a submissive position because their nurturing is being abused. So, like I said, I'm sure there'll be questions. So if anything comes to mind, just jot it down and I'll be, happy to respond. If you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment if you have any questions. You can also, if you don't feel comfortable asking the question publicly, you can also email me at openheartsunite@gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you. So, you know, don't worry about that. So, as a reminder, I don't engage with BDSM apologia or sex work apologia. So, this space is for those who are survivors of BDSM and supporters of BDSM only. So, anybody who crosses that line will be removed because I have healthy boundaries. So, let's begin on how not to talk to BDSM survivors. I'll be making more videos, so make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I will be putting that here. And I'll be putting that in the chat here. And I'm just going to put a link to my website here because you can also reach that. All of my social media links are right there. So it's openheartsunite.org and also freefrombdsm.com. So you'll be able to find everything there as well. So here we go. Number one, quote unquote, you consented, or BDSM is consensual. This is saying to an abuse survivor, you asked for it. You can never consent to abuse. You just can't. No matter, even if you beg for it, who is that person that they did it? So the onus is on the person who enacts the abuse. Okay, because if someone's asking for abuse, like I'm now in a healthy place in my life, right? I only have healthy people in my life. And if I were to come to the people that are in my life now and be like, I want, something painful or masochistic or whatever, they would not try to take advantage of that. They would be very concerned for me and lovingly find me the support I need to move away from that. They wouldn't prey upon that. So the whole thing about BDSM, it warps the conversation of consent and it actually twists it into victim blaming and leaving the abuser free from blame. Number two, BDSM is healing. BDSM is healthy. There is nothing healthy or healing about BDSM because there is nothing healthy or healing about abuse. Now, I was so in this world, like I said, for 13 years that exactly, Brenna, you can consent with a ball gag in your mouth. That is just flat out truth. Now, I was so in the world for 13 years that I was creating a school to train DOMs. That was the level of my expertise. So I and I say school lightly because that's not school. I was creating a curriculum and all of this. And I used to say the same BDSM rhetoric. If it's not safe, sane, and consensual, which is the BDSM motto, it's not BDSM. It's abuse. Well, when I went into that world, when I finally was trying to be like, okay, well, I have to find the line so I can tell everybody how great BDSM is, and I realized there was no line. That was devastating because my whole world shattered. So I understand why people who are BDSM don't want to hear what I have to say, because the level of self responsibility and the level of self awareness and the self reflection that's needed to realize the impact of what BDSM is and who I was being in BDSM, it's intense. But I am so glad I faced it because I was able to start to realize what happened, then realize what happened to me, and then actually create a healthy conversation and create a healthy life. So there's also, people give credit to BDSM for modalities that have nothing to do with BDSM. Like, people try to say that bondage is acupressure. I was one of those people myself, believe me. If you can think of a BDSM rhetoric, I said it times 10. And so, but the reality is you do not need to be humiliated and bound to get acupressure. That's completely inaccurate, and it's quite insane to say. And there are people, what they're looking for, what can be really helpful for some people who have trauma, and it could be triggering for other people. So, of course, everybody has to find that distinction for themselves. But swaddling, like, we have that infant need at times to swaddle, which can help some people who are going through trauma, but again, trigger others. So, just a warm blanket, or for some people, a weighted blanket really helps. But again, that's up to the individual. So when people try to bring healing modalities into BDSM, it stops being a healing modality when you mix it with abuse. That's no longer healing, that's grooming. Okay, number 3. I support BDSM because I'm open minded. You're just not being open minded. First of all, if you were to say this to any other Me Too survivor, just imagine that. Imagine what that would look like. People wouldn't say that, or if they did, there would be an issue. We would automatically see that was an issue. There is nothing open-minded about shutting down the voices of survivors. And there's nothing open-minded about, you know, saying that, pretending that BDSM survivors don't exist. That's not open-minded. There's nothing open-minded about gaslighting a survivor. And so, but this is the arrogance and blindness that BDSM promotes. BDSM is sexual slavery out in the open, even using the term sex slave. I mean, there's very openly stated in BDSM. There's nothing open-minded about promoting sexual slavery or trying to silence survivors. Number 4, you had a bad experience. Now, I know that survivors, right? Isn't that ridiculous? So I know this is like a bizarre gaslighting that I've actually heard also said to survivors of the sex trafficking, incorrectly called the sex industry. Oh, you just had a bad experience. And what? So this is a very bizarre gaslighting, which presumes that the healthy person speaking up about their abuse is somehow too unhealthy to be abused properly. It's nonsensical. I mean, just throw that one out. If you ever hear it, it doesn't even make any sense. I mean, that is really, really, wow. Tiffany, I'm so sorry that the court told you that. That's horrifying. That's absolutely ridiculous. And this is exactly the issue, because this is the language that BDSM creates. And this is why, survivors don't get the justice that they're supposed to get, or even the listening, or even acknowledgement of existence. It's really horrifying. Number 4, there have been studies that BDSM is healing. Now, this one's new for me, but I encountered this just recently. This past week, I actually encountered this. Someone was trying to tell me there are statistics about this. Well, there are also statistics that me as a Black woman, that I apparently have a smaller brain than white people. That is also a statistic out there. So I say that to give you guys a reality check on who is doing the statistics, because unless it's someone who is actually dedicated to the truth of the statistics can be warped to feed an agenda as well. Now, Also, the people who may be doing this could either be supporters or in BDSM, or could be gaslighted by the conversations of BDSM and not know the nuances of the differences of what makes something healing and what doesn't. So if someone believes that they're being told that BDSM is healing, they'll be like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. But actually, there's also different reactions that the body has that unfortunately people call healing, and it's actually not. There is an adrenaline rush that people can have after they have experienced an abusive situation, a traumatic situation. Then there is an elation from surviving trauma, which can be joyful, joyous, and be like, oh my God, I made it through. And then those people incorrectly attribute the elation of surviving a traumatic experience with BDSM must be healing. No, you are a survivor and you just survived something horrifying. That feeling that you're experiencing is all you and is accredited to your ability to survive trauma, not your ability, not BDSM being healing. Uh, yeah, it's just absolutely terrible. If Oh my goodness, Rebecca, I'm so sorry that you experienced that. If it was so violent, how come you're still alive? Well, I don't understand why people think and this is a problem. BDSM leaves people feeling entitled to say this to BDSM survivors. So yeah, that's just, yeah. So BDSM is not healing at all. I just want to make that abundantly clear. And I explored it in so many ways. I wanted BDSM to be healing because I was a Dom and I wanted to live the lie and justify myself and be right. Because the opposite of that, realizing who I was being, was really terrifying. And when I finally faced it, it took me 7 years to come out of the shock of the things I did, who I was being. It was a horrifying mirror. And I was just blown away. I was like, oh my God, how did that happen? And BDSM never starts with the hardest things you see. It starts with little tiny things. And just like any other abuse, any other gaslighting or grooming, it escalates and it continues. And with BDSM, it creates an addictive experience because you need more, bigger, more painful, more everything to experience, because BDSM does not promote enhancement of the senses, it deadens the senses. It actually is a numbing out, not an opening up. Number 6, people have a right to do what they want. I want a Lamborghini. I don't have a right to go steal it. So, no, this is just a ridiculous statement. People do not have a right to do what they want. That's why we have laws. I mean, clearly. Number 7, you're being a prude. So BDSM gaslights people both in and out of BDSM to believe if you're not being abused, if you're not being immersed in the sexual violence that is BDSM, you're not sexually empowered. It's twisted. Actually, the reality is I love my sexuality. I did the self-work and the healing to realize that my sexuality is not dirty or bad, and therefore I'm very clear my sexuality does not deserve to be punished, and I don't deserve to be punished or harmed for being sexual. So actually, BDSM is extremely prudish. Number 8, you're being self-righteous. Telling a survivor they are being self-righteous in correcting people's ignorance in regards to BDSM is a downright disgusting and violent attempt at shutting down a survivor's voice. A survivor is not being self-righteous in sharing their abuse. And the reality that BDSM is abusive is the reality that the survivor has tapped into their righteousness. And for a survivor, especially a BDSM survivor in a world with little to no listening of their existence, the righteousness is hard won. You would not tell another Me Too survivor that them coming forward about their rape is self-righteous. Why would you feel entitled to do so with a BDSM survivor? Because that is the language set up by BDSM. Number 9, to each their own. This is, if someone says, oh, to each their own, this is dismissive. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I don't want to seem closed-minded. That's the kind of statement that is. This is what BDSM has done. It's left people afraid to say anything. in opposition of BDSM, lest the person be seen as not cool or not socially aware or not sexually empowered. Don't say this to a BDSM survivor. This is a direct dismissal of what they survived and still a sideways way to support BDSM. Number 10. BDSM is just another aspect of healthy sexuality. Abuse is not sexuality, period. So no, that's completely wrong. 11. Are you sure you're not kink shaming yourself? Okay, there is no such thing as kink shaming. It's called getting healthy and facing underlying unmet issues, which keeps a person trapped in an unhealthy loop. As for the statement kink positive, that's ridiculous. There's no such thing as kink positive. That is abuse enabling. Okay, and this is an issue because this BDSM has injected itself into psychology, which is dangerous and downright deadly. I have personally had experiences with such psychologists and therapists who were either practicing BDSM themselves or taught to support it, though most likely practicing it. There are psychologists who know nothing about BDSM, except they have been taught by the BDSM community who have persuasively pushed their agenda and now are told, they're told to like support couples and people encouraged to follow the BDSMer in the relationship to the detriment of the partner who does not want to. So BDSM is now being pushed by therapists because they think they're doing something right. So some of these therapists, they just don't know better. They are taught by other people and they think they're doing something right. And later they find out the devastation of BDSM. So kind of feel for them too, because this is their profession and they're trying to do right by people, but they don't know what they're being pushed to do. So this is dangerous and needs to stop. And so I am also here to educate mental health professionals on the reality of what BDSM is. Number 12. Don't listen to vanilla people if you want the truth about BDSM. Now, vanilla is a BDSM term, so if you're still using it, stop. Because you're continuing the BDSM language and you're enabling BDSM to continue its language. So don't encourage the BDSM reality. There's no such thing as vanilla. Okay, that is a BDSM term to shame those who do not practice BDSM specifically, as if BDSM is the basis of sexuality and vanilla is the outsider. You are not vanilla for not being in the abuse that is BDSM. It's called being healthy. Number 13. You should let people have their opinion and not be so judgmental in how you speak about this. Supporting abuse is not an opinion. If I smack someone in the face and say, it's my opinion, that is not abuse. It's sexy because in my opinion, smacking someone in the face is sexy. That is not, in fact, an opinion. That is an unhealthy and unstable mindset, not an opinion. Okay. A survivor speaking up about the reality of their abuse is not being judgmental. It is being factual and raising awareness. The judgment is trying to silence a survivor and gaslight them as if speaking up about their abuser is an affront to the abuser. Okay, so this is like being supportive of the abuser. It's protecting the abuser to say things like this to a BDSM survivor. And being judgmental about their abuser, and how dare the survivor judge their abuser, and the modality BDSM, which supports the abuse and was used to abuse them. We would not say this, again, we would not say this to a rape survivor, yet if it happens in BDSM and a Me Too survivor of BDSM comes forward, people feel entitled to say this. Because make no mistake, rape, kidnapping is prevalent in BDSM and is the basis of it. Now, a lot of people think kidnapping, they think you're covered with a hood and dragged out the house. That's one form of kidnapping that we all know about. But kidnapping is the inability, the fear of not being able to leave someplace and the inability to leave someplace. That is consistent in BDSM. That's kidnapping. So if you wouldn't say these things to any other rape survivor, do not say it to a BDSM survivor, as they are most likely a survivor of rape as well. You wouldn't say, how dare you be judgmental towards your rapist? You should let us have an opinion on what your rapist did to you and stop acting like you know so much about your rape. Then do not say it to a Me Too survivor of BDSM. Number 14, I'm going to play devil's advocate. That statement, I'm going to play devil's advocate. And again, I got to keep bringing it back to this you know, conversation. If someone were to say that to any other survivor, we would recognize it immediately that this is apologia. But people feel entitled to do this to survivors of BDSM because BDSM is set up this way. And that in itself is an issue with BDSM. It is set up to erase survivors completely. And when survivors speak up, they are met with intense gaslighting and grooming opposition. This is why most do not speak up and come to me privately sharing how they feel unseen and terrified to mention their abuse because the BDSM community is set up to silence them. And BDSM has set up society to not recognize BDSM as abuse and therefore not recognize the Me Too survivors of BDSM, even though BDSM is deadly and extremely abusive. Physically, sexually, intensely psychologically, and even spiritually, for many who have their religion or spirituality used against them as a weapon in the Dom's sadistic abuse. And yes, you heard that right. There are people who are using the person's religion as a weapon against them and leave people with trauma in engaging, and they have trauma and they have difficulty reconnecting with the religion that they love and want to reconnect with because of BDSM. The same goes for non-religious spirituality. That's devastating. When you come between a human being and their connection to spirit and spirituality, something is off. Okay, this is dangerous. BDSM is not a game, it's not a joke. It's breaking people down psychologically, sexually, and spiritually. Number 15, what you're saying is up for debate. My abuse is not up for debate. No survivor's abuse is up for debate. Therefore, the Me Too survivors of BDSM, their abuse is not up for debate. And this is exactly why other BDSM survivors stay in the shadow, statements like this. And they come to me in the back channels thanking me for what I do. Saying that a BDSM survivor coming forward and stating the reality that BDSM is abuse is up for debate is just another shutdown tactic. If it were any other Me Too survivor, again, we would realize how shaming, violent, and dismissive this is. And when it comes to survivors, there is no debate in this context, and it is really a silencing tactic. This is all inherent in the BDSM setup to leave people feeling as if abuse itself is debatable. It's not. This is a very simple concept. Abuse is not debatable, but BDSM creates the languaging to pretend that it is. A survivor is not debatable. They are sharing what they're survived, and their abuse is not up for debate. And debate is not even the correct term here. This statement is just another mental gymnastics tactic to shut down the survivors of BDSM and keep the abusive status quo of BDSM alive and unquestioned. And I'm not buying it. I do not engage with BDSM apologia. I stopped doing that because there's nothing there. So there's no reason to. This is not about the supporters of BDSM and saying there should be a debate. It's another way for the supporters and those who act out with BDSM, even the supporters who've never been in BDSM who support BDSM, to make it about them and overshadow the survivors yet again and enforce victim blaming tactics. So that way the BDSMers and the supporters of BDSM come out into the forefront and overshadow the survivors and push them in the back to shut up. We're not doing that. No. Number 16, BDSM makes you powerful. No, it doesn't. That is a fallacy. BDSM does not make me or any other survivor of BDSM powerful. I am powerful, and each survivor of BDSM is powerful. BDSM actually creates a false sense of power, which is actually powerlessness, and leaves people feeling as if they need to be given power, take power, or ask for power, when this is a fallacy. We are all innately powerful. That is called sovereignty. 17. BDSM is healthy. People think outside of the box. There is nothing healthy about abuse and denial of abuse, and a system set up to silence those that question the emperor's new clothes. And I'm here to say the emperor has no clothes, he's bucket naked, and that's BDSM. Okay? And BDSM is not even new, it's been around since the beginning of time. It's called torture. So there's nothing new or innovative about BDSM. There's no thinking outside of the box beyond how to find new ways to harm someone. And we don't call that innovation, we call that sadism. BDSM is not progressive. It is the already established norm in a sexually violent society. BDSM is not going against the norm, it is the norm, and it actually perpetuates the norm. It's not impressive. Number 18, but BDSM is play. In the BDSM world, the word play is being used, and it's actually used to hook the inner child into accepting harm. Because when the inner child hears play, it's like, yay, I want to come play. But it shuts off the word that comes after. So there'll be things like um, or the word that's used in conjunction with the play. So you'll hear things like blood play. Oh, play. The inner child goes straight for the play, right? Or you hear the word rape play, which is horrifying. Those words do not belong together. And that's, again, a grooming and gaslighting coercive tactic in itself. But when the inner child hears play, that's what they go for. They go for the hope. Our inner child wants to see the best, it wants to hope the best. And so that is a very sick way to hook the inner child into a world of abuse. Number 19, BDSM is shadow work, and shadow work is important for healing. We're quoting this. Okay, so shadow work is important for healing, yes, but BDSM is not shadow work. It's shadow worship. There's a difference. So BDSM does not allow the shadow to transform and show its innate reality, which holds a golden nugget of self-love trapped in the folds of shame, confusion, and survival by a hurt inner child. The inner child needs a healthy space to express. BDSM is not a safe space for the inner child. It is an abusive space which will recreate past abuse and keep the inner child shut down and trapped. BDSM is not inner parenting. It is the recreation. It's the recreation of parental and other authority-based abuse, which keeps the inner child in a space of neglect and harm. BDSM reinforces the hurt inner child's feelings of deserving this punishment and abuse. That is not shadow work, okay? That is shadow reinforcement. When the shadow cannot express its innate true self, which is a golden nugget of self love screaming to be met, seen, and received with love and healthy guidance on how to express, not from a little child trying to maneuver an adult body and mind, rather a healthy age appropriate expression, the shadow is doomed to stay stuck and not reach transformation. And that's just not fair. Enslaving the shadow that way is not shadow work. A shadow unable to transform begins to putrefy and rot, which only supports the development of more acting out behaviors, which is a flashy form of repression and restriction, not rather than the healthy self-expression, full self-expression that is available to all of us. BDSM is not shadow work. Self love is shadow work. BDSM is shadow reinforcement, which leaves the shadow running the show, and children are not supposed to drive for a reason. BDSM is a hurt child's temper tantrum run amok in an adult world of exploitation. So, a few pointers on how to treat a survivor of BDSM. One, be careful of the topics you bring up around a BDSM survivor, especially topics such as electricity, anything to do with tying knots or rope, if you're talking about boating, which may seem ridiculous to some people, but because of the nature of the abuse of BDSM can actually really be a trauma trigger. Now, of course, you're not going to know all of the trauma triggers, but just be mindful. And also, if people are saying, I do shadow work, good chance you need to run away from that person, because usually people use that to suck people in and really harm people and actually project their own issues onto another person. Now, the whole conversation of shadow is actually very healthy in a Carl Jung aspect. If you want to learn more about that, I would just Google Carl Jung. He actually had a very healthy conversation of the shadow and the shadow work. So if you want to know what that really is, go do some research on Carl Jung. I'm going to write his name here. So Carl Young. You can look him up. He was the one, I believe he coined the term shadow work, but don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. But he was the one who went in on a healthy way. So there are people who call themselves Jungians who they would be able to, but they don't go around being like, I do shadow work. They so if you look up, I'm gonna write that term too, Jungian. They also don't run around calling themselves Jungians. So if you happen to uh, see them or get in contact with them, they're pretty amazing. This there, David Bedrick is really amazing psychologist. And he does a lot of, well, anyway. So people who follow the works of Carl Jung, they don't go around trying to lure people into shadow work. The people who go around being like, I do shadow work, blah, blah, are usually using it in a way that's very unhealthy. So be very, very careful about that. But if you do want to know for yourself a little bit more about shadow, the human shadow and that archetype and the concept and everything, go to Carl Jung. I've also kind of created my own experience of with my personal research in my, my life that I learned that my shadow was really just a hurt inner child. So, thanks for joining us, Bashan. And Bashan, the full video will be available on my YouTube. So feel free to, here's my website again, and feel free to find my YouTube channel there so you'll be able to see the rest of this. So, yeah, so I would say definitely do that as a self discovery if you're curious about shadow work. Just be very careful about other people. But the people that if you meet the Jungians, they're pretty cool about that. But random people saying they do shadow work, just be very careful. And that unfortunately has found itself hooked into the BDSM world. You see people saying this is shadow work, and that is completely incorrect. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And what shadow work looks like for each person is going to be individual. For me, I feel like there's a very gentle, sweet, loving way to do the work, and it's not as yeah. But anyway, for me personally, self love is shadow work. It's like you taking that time to take to look inside yourself and see the parts that of self exploration and see what that looks like and all the parts of self that can be hidden or have been pushed away by shame, and then meeting it and loving it. And for me, that also includes inner parenting is shadow work to me. It's like meeting that hurt inner child that's having that big temper tantrum trying to figure out how to function in a society or in a world in an adult body. I also say I give my inner child expression, I give my inner infant expression, I give my inner teen expression. So giving these aspects of self that I have experienced abuse throughout my life, a listening, and things that want to come up, and I can tell it's my hurt inner child or my shadow or whatever you want to call it. Not everybody might believe in the shadow archetype or all that stuff. That's up to you. I'm definitely not telling you what to believe because I don't believe in that. I believe that everybody's personal journey is their own and you will find what's true for you. Okay, so another pointer on how to treat a survivor of BDSM. Number two, do not push a BDSM survivor to calm themselves using breath or meditation. Breath is often controlled in BDSM, so that can be a very huge trigger for a BDSM survivor. Where other people, they're like, oh, I'm going to breathe, and that's great, and someone helping them through a breath might help them. With a BDSM survivor, you can actually spin that survivor into a deeper trigger. So if you're dealing with someone who's a survivor of BDSM, that's something to be very mindful of. Also, meditation in times, and thank you, Vishon, meditation at times is with anybody on the trauma spectrum is not always the best, especially if you have CPTSD or PTSD. I have complex PTSD. So there are certain things that Brenna, I have a bulge in my C4, C5 vertebrae from being choked. I am so sorry you experienced that. That's that's not right. Thank you for sharing so vulnerably here. Yeah. And this is why, these conversations are so important. Thanks for being here, Brenna. Yeah. So these are things you have to be mindful of when there's a BDSM survivor. So, which she just shared right there, that would create a lot of, triggers. So you have to be mindful of what the person has survived. And meditation is not always great for survivors of trauma. It can actually trigger deeper things and can bring repressed memories up. And if you don't have the capacity to support someone through that, and and that's okay if you don't, but just I wouldn't push everybody to meditate, because there are certain times I can and there are certain times I can't, and so I have to kind of consciously be aware of that, and that's for each survivor. And some survivors cannot meditate at all, and that's okay. So I think that's something to be mindful as well. Number three, don't ever sneak up on a BDSM survivor, ever. Just don't do it. This is something that it's a pretty staple for most survivors. You just don't know what the reaction is going to be, because you could instantly trigger someone into a fight or flight, and they could black out and you can get hurt. But then you just have to be mindful that that's a survivor, and especially a BDSM survivor. You could really psychologically hurt them or psychologically trigger something very intense by boo or sneaking up behind someone. For someone else, that might just be like, oh, a little thrill. Not for a survivor, and especially not for a survivor of BDSM, when it's so completely based on psychological trauma. Tiffany, I had my hyoid bone broken and I have a straightened C spine now, and I can't sing anymore. I love you too, sweetie. And I'm so sorry you survived that. And thank you for, being here to share. I know you guys been through so much, and I'm so glad you're sharing here. And people need to know that BDSM is not a joke. This stuff is deadly. And, the fact that you guys survived, I'm so glad that you did. So I'm really glad you're here. And number four, don't assume that what is gentle for you will be gentle for a BDSM survivor. BDSM is filled with horror movie experiences. And when someone has experienced that extensive level of horrifying trauma, I'm not talking about, you just heard what the two survivors shared. This isn't talking about something that, you see in a movie, or that's like some fantasy, some loving fantasy. This is something you see in a horror movie stuff. Okay, this is like straight up horror movie things that BDSM survivors have survived. This is not something small. And if you're watching HBO BDSM videos, you have no clue what BDSM is. If you're believing that what these people are telling you, that, oh, it's sexually empowered, there is nothing empowering about people being able to harm people on this level. You don't get to disable people and act like this is sexual empowerment. That's not okay. And to hurt someone so severely. So when people have experienced this intensity of hurt and pain, and made to believe that slavery is empowering and stuff like that, when you live that, a tender notion in contrast can feel abrasive. And I know for me, at first, I thought loving experiences or gentle experiences, I was like, what the hell is that? I have no clue what you're doing right now. This is terrifying. I was terrified. When people first started to come to me with tenderness and kindness and gentleness, it was so alien to me because of BDSM that I would fall apart. Like, I did not know how to handle it. So you actually have to be mindful of what you're bringing to a BDSM survivor, and do it in small increments, and let them lead it. Because if you're like, here, we're going to do something soft and gentle, that can actually feel just as violent, if not more. And what it can do is actually push the person deeper into BDSM, because it's become so comfortable, and the gentle expression is so horrifying that it can trigger so much. It can also trigger the mourning. That person may have never experienced gentleness, and so it brings up And for me, even to this day, every time I get a blessing or something beautiful, I have to mourn the past of not having experienced that. So you have to be very, very gentle. You have to be very gentle of what you're, you know, what you're bringing forward. So the people are in BDSM are some of the people who seek something out of the ordinary, but what happens is that seeking is then exploited and warped by BDSM and harmed. So I believe it is that seeking, albeit warped by BDSM by exploiters, it can be transformed back into healthy ingenuity, which is was innately there to begin with before it was harmed by BDSM. Um, Taylor. So then there are books like 50 Shades of Grey, a good depiction of what BDSM is like. I do direct services with victims of sex trafficking, but none of my clients have disclosed that this was a part of their story, but I'm sure it has been. I I refuse to read the BDSM, the 50 Shades of Grey. I will not watch those movies because they will trigger me intensely. There was a huge debate going on. Yeah, I hear you, Brenda. It's just we as survivors, we can't delve into those books. That would just be horrifying from us. What I've heard from other people, the brutality of it is I would say that they haven't even gotten to cover how severe BDSM is in 50 Shades of Grey. There were people in BDSM, there was a split. There were some people that are like, that's not like BDSM. And I'm like, from what I heard of the book, and I'm like, well, then you must be in extreme denial, or you don't know what BDSM is. You've been on the surface of it. You've never really lived BDSM. But from what I've heard, um, it's supposedly a little, horrific. But BDSM is so much worse than what I've heard from people who have watched that. Um, Yes, Rebecca, much of pain is invisible. Yeah, makes you feel so insane because violence is placed onto my body and soul. I survived by blocking it out, and that was torture. Yeah, I understand. I completely understand. And that's, I think, what people don't understand, don't know too, is BDSM also has severe psychological abuse. And when people are groomed in our society to impart the, the language of BDSM, a lot of people continue that pain and continue that abuse without even knowing it. That's why I was like, let me start a little, that's why I started the conversation of free from BDSM and why I wanted to do this. So we as a society really have failed everyone in BDSM. And I believe it's important to see that way rather than the other way around of the undertones that people in BDSM have somehow failed society. And it's that mentality. It's something we need to recognize and own and make amends to, starting with how we receive survivors of BDSM, beginning with acknowledging the Me Too survivors of BDSM and supporting the voices and healthy lives of survivors of BDSM. This includes raising our integrity and how we approach survivors of BDSM, which means learning how to hold BDSM survivors as precious, with tenderness and honor, respect and integrity, rather than meeting them with pimp language, grooming, and gaslighting that was been perpetuated by BDSM, which has become prevalent in our society. We need to stop doing the pimp's job for them in silencing survivors of BDSM and pushing people who were in BDSM to stay on the fringes of society. People utilize BDSM and then go hide and play in normal society and point the finger as those BDSMers. But I tell you, so many of your average looking, upstanding citizen would be deep in BDSM. And I know that personally. I saw it. So pushing people into the fringes is exactly what supports BDSM staying alive and thriving. Engaging and welcoming people into healthy community with healthy boundaries, as long as the person respects the healthy boundaries, is paramount. Unity, understanding, patience, and togetherness heals. However, again, only if the person is in a place to be healthy about it. If at any time someone tries to enroll you or become abusive towards you, and always stand in your healthy boundaries and take care of yourself, including taking distance if needed for your safety. Your safety comes first and is foundational. Never sacrifice yourself for anyone. BDSM is society. It is a highlighted experience of society in action. We need to do better, and it begins with each of us. How we treat ourselves, how we treat each other, treating ourselves with self love, self care, tenderness, and understanding that we inherited a world that is calling for a healing in order to heal itself. Please do share this conversation as far and wide and publicly as you can so we can create awareness of the Me Too survivors of BDSM and acknowledge what most people already know. BDSM is abuse. That being said, please do not single someone out to share this to if you know someone who is in BDSM. What I mean by that is just because someone's in BDSM doesn't mean we have to, like, I'm not here to convince or push anybody. I'm here to educate people. Because if you do that, that can actually push someone deeper into BDSM and cause more harm than good, as those in BDSM are groomed to stay and will only feel more pressured by an outright demand to see things differently. I'm not here to convince anyone, as I said, I'm here to educate. And I create these conversations for people who are looking for it. So I have faith that those who need to connect with me, as this conversation spreads, they will find me. If you know someone who is questioning or unsure or is a survivor and has come to you with concerns about BDSM, then absolutely share my information with them because that means they are seeking a way out. So yeah, so thank you so much. This has been How Not to Talk to BDSM Survivors, and these are some ways to be conscious when engaging with a BDSM survivor. I will be making more videos and talking more about this on my YouTube channel as in my conversation of anti-BDSM called Free from BDSM. And make sure to follow my blog on freefrombdsm.com for more writing on this as well. So thank you so much for listening. And I'm now going to end the recording and put the links in the chat and yeah, take questions.